Okay. So I just want to cover one more item on the issue of gambling and raffles, and that is that the Rav Shulchan Aruch had said that a person, if there was a bet, two people make a bet, as long as they didn't make a kinyan when they made a bet, then the losing party has a legal right to withdraw and not pay the bet. So two guys are sitting at the Shabbos table and they want to know who won the 1959 World Series, right? So Rashai Lachzor Bo, if one guy says, I'll bet you $20 it was the Reds and not the Yankees or something like that. So we had said that if they don't shake hands on it, if they don't make any kind of serious commitment, so then it's not a legally binding commitment on either side. And therefore, if a guy wants to back out, he can back out. He says, and if you remember the Imrei Yaakov had brought a distinction. Let's see, in halacha. Just see. Right. He said that even if they shook hands, but it was on something that happened in the past, then the guy could still back out. But if it's on something that's going to happen in the future, like who's going to win the Super Bowl this year, and they make a bet, so it's only legally binding if they shake hands. But if they don't shake hands, it's not legally binding. So therefore, you're allowed to. There are circumstances where you're allowed to withdraw from the commitment when you make a bet with a friend, make a wager. However, he said, and this is the qualification, Ela im kain hitchayev bitain litzdaka. Unless a person made a wager, and in the course of making the wager, instead of saying, "I'll bet you $20," that the Bills are going to win the Super Bowl. The guy instead makes a wager, and he says, "You're going for Dallas. I'm going for Buffalo, but whoever loses the bet has to give $100 to the other person's favorite charity. Do we have a deal?" Right. So in that situation, even if there's no handshake, even if there's no kinyan, because you made a commitment to give money to tzedakah, you have an obligation to make good on the bet. So that's an important distinction, la halacha, and it's a very practical thing because sometimes two friends will make a friendly wager, but if they make a commitment to that stakes on the wager are for charity, they can't just say, "Oh, we weren't serious about it." So once you make a commitment to charity, your commitment becomes halachically binding. And the principle is sha'amirasam legavoa k'mesira lehedjot, that as soon as you say you're going to do something for tzedakah, which is really giving money for Hashem, because tzedakah is like giving something for God because you're doing a mitzvah, then it's k'mesira lehedjot. It's as if you've given it to a human being already. It's almost as if you've given cash from your pocket and put it in an escrow for that charity, just by saying. And we know that from the fact that the Torah has the concept called hektish, that as soon as you say that this book belongs to the temple, right? Once you say that, so it immediately becomes hektish without you having to physically donate it to the temple. And the same thing is true with charity. Once you make a verbal declaration, it becomes legally binding for you to follow through with that pledge. And we've seen this before. We've talked about this before in areas of Hilchos Tzedakah. But I just wanted to show you something from the Biurim, where he states as follows. Mashma, he says, the dafka be'imhaya amira mifureshes sheyitain litzdaka az nitchayev al yedei. It seems from the language of the Rav Shulchan Aruch that only if you actually verbalized this commitment to charity when you make your wager, that you become obligated. Aval imrak chashav belibo she'im hu yenatzeach az yitain litzdaka kach v'kach. But let's say a person makes a wager, or he buys a lottery ticket, which is a more common thing. A guy buys a lottery ticket, and he's thinking to himself, "Oh Hashem, if you let me win the $10 million, I'll give $1 million to charity, or I'll give two million to charity, or 3 million. I'll give half of it to charity." So az lo mechuyav litain. So because he's thinking about it, but he hasn't said it explicitly with his mouth, he does not become obligated to give it, even though that's normally not the halacha. Because normally, as we've talked about before, the Shulchan Aruch says that even just mentally committing yourself to give something to tzedakah makes you obligated to give. So why is it that when you're buying a lottery ticket or making a wager, you have to actually verbalize it in order to become halachically obligated, whereas when you think about something that you're going to do for tzedakah, you become obligated by just a mental thought. So he says, "Ve'ein lahakshos mehad kasaf harama b'yordeis in Reishon and Ches if Yud Gimel v'imchashav b'libo litain eze davar litzdaka chayiv l'kayim machashavto ve'ein tzarich hamirad kam l'shana." He says the Rama in Yoredei and the laws of tzedakah says that just making a mental commitment that you're going to give something to a certain charity makes you halachically obligated. And that's why when we talked about this halacha some time ago, we said that, when you are thinking about giving tzedakah, you should not formulate a real crystallized commitment of how much and to whom you're going to give, because when you do that, even though you never actually said it, if you crystallize that thought in your mind and you say, "I'm definitely going to do this," you become halachically obligated. And we actually learned this back when we first started this sefer. That we saw that in chapter 1 of this sefer. Alma begam b'machshava bilvad mitchayvim litzdaka. So you see that even with just thought alone, you become obligated to give to charity. So how do you reconcile it? What is it? Is it the verbalization that makes you obligated, or is it the thought? He says, the yesh lomar al pi mashakasav hashita mikubetzis min adarim zayin amad aleph b'zel lashon. So he says, let me bring in a commentary, from a medieval commentary called the Shita Mikubetzis, that says as follows. He says, "V'kashli gabe tzedakah im bedaito hayil tzedakah lama lo nischayvu mishum nediv leiv the omar b'shvuos gomer belibo afal pi shelo hotzi bisfasa." He says, why is it? And the Shita Mikubetzis says that sometimes you are obligated only when you verbalize it, and sometimes you're obligated even after you just mentally think about it. He says, "B'shem agomar belibo pirusha shenisyashiv belibo lasos hatzdaka v'lo yitcharet. Aval kan lo nityashev alav libo kol kach ad kan l'shana." And he says it depends what kind of thought we're talking about. If we're talking about a thought that you have crystallized completely, then you become obligated through your mental commitment. But if you are just mulling it over and you're thinking, I'm thinking about giving $1,000 to this charity, but you haven't committed yourself, so then you don't become halachically obligated. And we have the same kind of distinction that's drawn with a pledge that you make mentally to fast. Let's say this Sunday is a fast day. Let's say it's not. Let's say you want to accept upon yourself a personal fast, right? And so we say that you're supposed to at mincha, you're supposed to accept upon yourself that tomorrow you're going to fast, right? But the question is, how are you supposed to do it? So if you just mentally mull it over and think maybe I'll fast tomorrow, so that's not a halachically binding commitment. But if you mentally commit yourself to fasting, so then that's considered a halachically binding commitment. So he says, "O hamara, and therefore it would seem that when we're talking about the sachik bekuvia, like gambling or lotteries or bets, so even though you had this thought in your mind that if you win the raffle, then you'll give half of it to tzedakah, mikol makom ein ze mikri gomar belibo. But that's not considered a full mental commitment. Why? Dekivin to ein ze vaday she'inatzeach v'asakein b'derech hasmachta. He says because you know that the chances of you winning are not great. So you make all kinds of promises to yourself and to Hashem based on the fact that you really are fairly certain that you're not going to win. He says, and therefore, even when that's the reason why when a person makes a bet, we said even though you verbalized it, but you didn't make a kinyan, you can't be held to it. But mikol makom kishahaya rak machshava einza begeder gomar beliba b'dam. He says, and that's why when it comes to tzedakah, right? If just a mental commitment is meaningless, and that's the reason why you have to actually say it. So, for when it's not for tzedakah and it's just with your friend, a verbal bet or commitment without a handshake is not legally binding, right? But when it comes to tzedakah, a verbal commitment that if I win, I will give to tzedakah, that is legally binding. And mental commitments to give to tzedakah are normally legally binding, but not when it comes to making a wager or buying a raffle ticket, because there's not enough of a mental commitment that you're going to do this, since in the back of your mind or in the front of your mind you really understand that you're not taking yourself seriously when you're thinking these things. Okay, so I just wanted to point that out. And now we can go back to the Shulchan Aruch. So let's learn halacha lamed beis.
So before we go, I have a question.
Yeah, sure, Izzy.
How does the halacha view these? Where you have a dinner and then afterwards they have a casino,
right?
Where you're actually betting. And, most of the time you get prizes after. You cash in for prizes.
Right. So
it is a tzedakah thing.
Yeah, it's for a charity. Listen, I was asked years ago if the shul could run a casino night as a fundraiser. And I said that we could find a heter to do it, but I didn't think that it was the right thing to do thematically for a synagogue to run a casino night, because of basically the halachas that we learned so far. Is it halachically permitted for a person to gamble? Yes, we said. Remember, we learned in the Imrei Yaakov over here. We learned the halacha v'chein pashat haminhag kisvarazu lischok bekuvia, that the minhag is already to allow a person to play dice. He does not become pasul le'edus. He does not become disqualified as a witness unless it becomes his primary source of revenue. B'chol ze midina. Now that's the letter of the law. Aval lamaisa shomer nafsho yirchak mizeh. But a person who's concerned about the welfare of his soul should distance himself from gambling, afilu l'sachek b'li ma'os, even to gamble to play gamble with when there's no stakes, when there's no money at stake. Right? And okay, so there's this frowning upon gambling. Why? Because we know that, number one, it generates resentment among people, when they lose. And also, as the Rav Shulchan Aruch had said, even though there's no legal isser to gamble with a non-Jew, but you're engaging in idle things. Because really a person should spend his time in matters of wisdom and trying to make the world a better place. So basically, my response was, there's definitely basis to permit it, but I didn't think that it was thematically keeping in line with what we were trying to represent ourselves as Orthodox Jews. Now, it's a very it's a very subjective thing, I have to admit. Like, we've done golf tournaments for the shul, and that's I've been okay with that, even though you could argue that spending a half a day playing golf is not divrei chachma, is not engaging in making yourself a wiser person and trying to make the world a better place, right? Or maybe you could, maybe I had someone once tell me that when he's out on the golf course, it clears his mind and allows him to appreciate the sublime world and nature around him, and he comes to a greater connection to God. Maybe when you hear that thwack, and you look up at the clouds and the green and the birds, and maybe that helps you. I don't know. Doesn't do very much for me, especially when it's really hot. But everyone has a different thing. So it's a subjective thing, Izzy. There are charities that do it. There are charities that don't do it. There are charities that have regular raffles, like even the most religious, Haredi institutions have raffles, right? But even raffles, we've seen that some poskim in the past have frowned upon it. And so I can't really say anything negative about it, a charity that has a casino night, because clearly there's a heter to do it. But okay, so let's go on to the next.
So, Rabbi, sorry for slowing down again, but
sure.
I think I posed this question that day when we got cut off and only a few of us returned, about socializing with non-Jews and the fact that there seems to be a leniency of gambling with a non-Jew, but isn't that making connections with a non-Jew, like drinking wine with them and breaking bread with them, that you'd think would be prohibited, that we just shouldn't interact with them in any sort of social way?
Yes, but the limitations on social interaction with non-Jews was never extended beyond drinking and going to a saloon with them. As a matter of fact, you're even allowed to have a beer with a non-Jew. You're just not supposed to drink wine with a non-Jew. So, we don't extend the limitations beyond what they are. There are many instances where your business, for example, might require you to, to socially interact with a non-Jew, to go out to dinner with the boss or whatever it is. So, many times it might be advantageous for your business to go and have it play a game of poker with the guys.
Yeah. Although I've heard there are opinions that you should try and avoid, the holiday parties and things like that. even though it's part of the business world, because of the environment it is and whatever, the year-end parties that I'm referring to.
If lewdness ensues at the year-end parties, then yeah, that might be.
Yeah, I'm not sure to that extent, but maybe obviously if that's the case for sure. But even just being amongst and with, but it's okay. Now I hear that that the Rebbeim set a specific restrictions on certain things, and we don't necessarily take the premise and expand it. We just use what they said were the ones we prohibit, and then leave it at that. So, okay, thank you.
And also remember, Paul, that that we tend to focus on things that are within our comfort zone. There are many people in the Jewish world who have a natural aversion to and are xenophobic to non-Jews to begin with. And so it's very easy to say you're better not interacting with them because they're goyim anyway, right? Well, if that was your natural inclination because you're very clannish and you don't really feel comfortable with people outside of your immediate circle, you would say that even if it wasn't codified in halacha. So let's make sure not to write our own Shulchan Aruch. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, no, I hear it. Thank you for that thoughtful answer. I appreciate it.
Yeah, sure. Okay. I always go back to that. There was a Twilight Zone episode way back in the day when I think the guy's name was Franklin, and he and his wife go to Las Vegas because his wife always wanted to go to Las Vegas, and he was like one of these salt of the earth Midwesterners who forswore any kind of gambling, swearing, cussing, all of these things, drinking, and like he just felt so uncomfortable and was telling his wife how I feel like I'm in Sin City. This is a terrible place. And then all of a sudden, she just says, just try it, Franklin. Just try it once. And he pulls the one-armed bandit. He pulls the slots. And then all of a sudden, like he's transformed. And like the whole show is, he hears the slot machine calling his name, Franklin, and he can't resist. And so
that was a very powerful show. I remember the rabbi did an episode of it in one of the Tuesday night series, and I remember growing up, that was such a powerful show. It scared me. I was a kid and I watched it, and I was just like, had dreams probably, because in a half an hour they just built such an incredible concept.
Yeah. They don't make television like that anymore.
Rod Serling, yes, indeed.
Okay. Hamasig gevul re'ehu. So now let's move on. We're starting a new halacha, which is to be masig gevul, which is encroachment. Encroachment is a form of gezel. Now, we're going to learn a few different aspects of encroachment, but the simplest aspect, which is what the Torah is making specific reference to, is when you move the marker of the property line to your advantage and take away some of your neighbors. This can happen very easily if you're building a fence on an area that didn't previously have a fence between you and your neighbor. He says you can potentially be in violation of the Torah if you move some of your neighbor's property and make it part of yours and move the property line over, even a finger's width, right? Oh, he won't mind. It's just a tiny little, it's half an inch, right? It's a centimeter. Doesn't matter. He says even a finger's width is a violation of this halacha. Im b'chazaka asa hareze gazlan, v'im hisig b'seiser hareze ganav. If you do it overtly, but you do so by force, you're called a gazlan. And if you do so surreptitiously, by stealth, you're a ganav. V'im be'eretz Yisrael hisig hagavul, over beveiz lav. And if you do this in Eretz Yisrael, so then you're in violation of two negative commandments, because belav genevo gzele, because you're either stealing, that's one, or and then there's a second prohibition of uvelosasi gavul re'acha v'gomer ba'aretz v'gomer. The Torah states explicitly, you shall not encroach upon the boundaries of your neighbor in the land that I am giving to you. So it's a specific prohibition when you're living in Eretz Yisrael, that not only are you in violation of stealing, but you're also in violation of this explicit prohibition. Why does the Torah only prohibit it in Eretz Yisrael? It could be because when we acknowledge that Hashem gave us the land in Eretz Yisrael, and it's not something that we attained on our own, so we have to be even more careful not to encroach, because then we're sort of going against Hashem's gift to us, in addition to the fact that we're taking something that belongs to another person. And Hashem wants that other person to have that small piece of land that I've taken. So that's the first halacha that we're going to see about hasagas kavul, about encroachment. Okay, so the Imrei Yaakov says that you violate two negative commandments in Eretz Yisrael, and he writes, Kain hu das harambam. This is the opinion of the Rambam of Ol Betur lo nizkar lav velo sigzol velo signov mishum dekar kain and exelis. He says, but the Tur, who's living in the same era as the Rambam, is of the opinion that it's technically you're not in violation of lo tigzol or lo tignov, because you cannot steal real estate. Real estate is not subject to theft, but you are still committing an avera. Al avera hu biyado, v'hu adin b'chutz laretz lo kasav de'over lo sigzol ela im asa b'chazaka harei ze gazlan. And similarly, outside of Eretz Yisrael, the Tur doesn't say that you have technically violated the biblical transgression of lo sigzol, but he just says you are a gazlan. And apparently there's a distinction, because if real estate is not subject to theft, but by preventing the legal owner of having access to his property, or by demarcating that it's my property, thus causing it to fall away from his possession eventually, so then I am considered to be a gazlan in some way. It's a fine distinction, but really la halacha, this distinction that the Imrei Yaakov is drawing, doesn't really make any difference. The bottom line is that what you're doing is prohibited by trying to encroach on your neighbor's property. And it's as I'm sure you can think about, it's very easy to be over on this. I know that there are many cases, even in like cities like ours, where a fence is built, and then like many years later, a guy will buy the house and he'll look at the schematics from the city of the property line, and he'll realize, hey, the neighbor built a fence in the middle, well past what he was supposed to do, or, and now how do we address it? How do we deal with it? So you have to go back to the city, and you have to, sometimes there are ways to correct it, but sometimes there's not. So, okay. We'll hold it here for today. We'll commence with halacha lamed gimel, and let me wish you all a good Shabbos. All right, take care, everybody.
Oh, so Monday we're back to 7:05, correct?
7:05, yeah.
Okay, excellent.
Shabbat shalom.